Well, hey everybody, welcome to Meck's online campus. So some of you are thinking, who is this guy? We've had a summer full of these young, vibrant, energetic 30-something speakers, and then out rolls this guy, someone whose only chance of having a smoking hot body is going to be at his cremation. I've been called by the name senior, as in senior pastor. I think it's because I'm at the age where everything is starting to click. My back, my knees, my neck. Anyway, enough of that. The only thing worse than bad jokes, dad jokes, or bad senior dad jokes. But then there are those of you who are tried and true Meckers. You're wondering who this is because I grew something over the summer. But if you're really long-term Meckers, you know that I used to have a beard. And when it started to get a little patchy gray or white in places and stay dark in others, I pretty much started to look like a zebra. So I shaved it off until it would be close to one color. And I kind of haven't tested that out in a while. So this summer I finally got it around to seeing if it would be a little more congruent. And what I really wanted, what I was dreaming for, was the Sean Connery beard. Did you ever see the movie Hunt for Red October? Most epic beard ever. Greatest beard in the world. I don't ever have a shot at that one. But I'll keep this one for a while due to some fierce lobbying from my two sons. Speaking of being away for a while, I want everyone to know how proud I am of our summer lineup of speakers. Oh my goodness. I didn't miss a single one. Melissa, Jonathan, Chad, Casey, Brad, Alexis, Robbie, Zach, they just hit it out of the park, week in and week out. And whether it was Jonathan with balloons, Chad with caskets, Robbie with bread, and Zach with sacks of silver and Olympic medals, I think it was the summer of props. It was great. Let me brag on the rest of you as well about something. We just finished our annual backpack drive. This is when you, as an individual or a family, you buy a new backpack. You follow a carefully prescribed list of needed items that were given to us by school principals. You packed it with supplies for elementary age students in need. It took time, it took money, it took intentionality, it took having a heart for other people. Last year, 667 individuals and families did this. This year, we set a new record of 842 backpacks for children in need. This is not only going to cover our Missions 2.0 partner, Bruns Elementary, where almost 99% of the children are at or below the poverty level, but still will enable us to also serve hundreds of others in need throughout our area. So, well done. Okay, let's get into our new series, one I'm really excited about and I've been wanting to do for a while. It's letting me chase a lot of things that I've never taught on and never had a chance to explore myself, so I'm excited. I don't know if you're familiar with the name of Liz Curtis Higgs. She's one of the best-known radio personalities in America. She used to tag team with Howard Stern. He was the morning show and she was the evening show. And she was a wild thing. I mean, just full of raunchy talk about sex and takedowns of men. In fact, she was so wild, so out there that Howard Stern actually told her that she needed to clean up her act. Okay, when Howard Stern tells you you need to clean things up, it's pretty rough. She had a Christian friend, though, who kept inviting her to church. And one day, after a long, long time of inviting, she actually went. And that week, guess what the message was about? The verse in the Bible that says, "Wives, submit to your husbands." Not exactly what her friend would have dialed up for Liz, even when carefully explained in a way that doesn't make it sound as audacious as it might at first glance. But she listened, and she was courteous and respectful. She didn't get up and just walk out. She sat through it. And when it came to the second part of the verse, the part where it says, "And husbands, you need to sacrifice yourself. You need to give yourself for your wives, just as Jesus sacrificed himself for the church and died for her." When Liz heard that, she leaned over to her friend and kind of laughed, and she said, "I would gladly give myself to any man who would be willing to die for me." And her friend leaned back and said, "Liz, that's what I have been trying to tell you for months. There is a man who loved you enough to die for you. His name is Jesus. That's how much he loves you." Not long after that, Liz did give her life to that man. In fact, she's now a well-known Christian author, but she writes about a very interesting subject. Most of her books deal with, I guess I should say, not subject, but a set of subjects. Pulling from her own rather checkered background, she started digging into the lives of a group of biblical characters that were fascinating to her and that she resonated with, but had been long neglected, and held huge life lessons for both women and men. She called her area of study the bad girls of the Bible. She found 7 types. Let me walk you through the 7 types. First were women who were bad to the bone. So bad, there's not a single good thing recorded about them anywhere in Scripture. Then there were women who were bad for just a moment. Women who made one gigantic mistake that rocked their lives and the lives of those around them. Then she found a group of women who were bad for a season, meaning they entered into a time where they went pretty far south, but then came back around in the end. Then there were women who experienced what she calls a bad moon rising, meaning trouble came knocking at their door. Instead of locking it and barring it, they opened it and welcomed it. Then there were the women who were bad, but for a good reason. Interesting group of people. God used what they did, even though what they did was a little on the sketchy side. Then there were those who were bad, but not condemned. They were revealed for who and what they were, who and what they did, but that revelation changed their life. Finally, the women who were bad and proud of it. Women who absolutely took no prisoners, made no apologies, and would dare you to call them anything. So let me tip my hat at the beginning of this series to Liz Higgs and her work prompting this idea, and for everything I'm going to be stealing from her from time to time as we go through some of these stories. In this series, we're going to walk through the 7 women who represent each one of those types, or at least a group. We'll walk through a selected 7 that I've picked. So there's going to be 7 weeks, 7 women, reflecting 7 types of breaking bad. So if you're ready, let's jump in, beginning with a woman who was absolutely bad to the bone. She's the one we're picking for that category. And even people not that familiar with the Bible have probably heard her name, Delilah, as in Samson and Delilah. And whatever you may think you know about her or her story, she was truly one of the coldest, most heartless, most conniving, manipulative, evil people you would ever read about. Now, to understand Delilah's story, we first have to understand her famous counterpart, Samson. Before there was Captain America and the Black Panther, Thor, Hulk, Wonder Woman, there was the first, the greatest, super strong hero of them all. The only difference is that he actually lived. Samson tore apart lions with his bare hands. He would take 30 men, he barehanded, and take them on like it was child's play. He once caught 300 jackals and tied them together in pairs of 2 by their tails. And then where he tied their tails together, he stuck a torch and he loosed all of them to destroy an entire nation's harvest. If tied with ropes, he could break through them like they were string. He once picked up the jawbone of a freshly killed ass and used it to slaughter over 1,000 warriors. He once tore out a city's entire iron entrance gate, his whole fortress entrance gate from the walls. He literally walked up to this huge gate of fortified steel and stone and tore it up from its buried foundations along with its posts and carried it more than 30 miles and then left it on a hill overlooking the city. Those gates were meant to demonstrate the city's defense against strength and power and attack, and he did it just to make a point that they were nothing compared to him. I think you could say point made. His last and perhaps greatest deed was single-handedly tearing down the foundations of an entire fortress, killing thousands of his enemies in the process. But we'll get to that one. The people on the receiving end of this were not just anybody. They were the Philistines, who had made the nation of Israel subject to them. God appointed Samson. He gifted Samson to quite literally be a holy terror to them and to bring about the liberation of Israel. But while we know him for his strength, his story and his story with Delilah is really about a vow going back to his birth. Let's read about it from the Old Testament book of Judges, which is where Samson's story is found. It says, "In those days, a man named Manoah from the tribe of Dan lived in the town of Zorah. His wife was unable to become pregnant, and they had no children. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, Even though you have been unable to have children, you will soon become pregnant and give birth to a son. So be careful. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden food. You will become pregnant, give birth to a son, and his hair must never be cut. For he will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines. When her son was born, she named him Samson. And the Lord blessed him as he grew up, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. Now, here's what is most significant about that. In those days, you could make a special vow to God and become a Nazirite, kind of like making a special vow to be a monk or a nun or a priest. That's what the word Nazirite means, someone who is set apart, someone who is separated, someone who is dedicated. And there were certain vows you had to follow while you were abiding by this period of dedication. You couldn't eat certain foods that were considered unclean. You couldn't drink anything fermented. You couldn't touch anything that was dead, and you couldn't cut your hair. Now, it's not that those things in and of themselves were wrong. This was just the way, as a Nazirite, that you demonstrated the fact that you were setting yourself apart, dedicating yourself in this very unique way to God. Much like there's absolutely nothing wrong with marriage, but a priest might take the vow of celibacy. These were the signs, the symbols of your unique calling from God. But the point wasn't what you were saying no to, but what these things were reminding you to say yes to, which was complete devotion to God. Now, here's what was unique about Samson. Samson did not make this vow himself for his life. God did. God set him apart. God called him to a special dedication, to be the liberator of the people of Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. Samson had the choice to either live out God's special dream for his life or not, but the calling was always there. Which brings us to an important note about Samson's life. When you read about his life, this man who had been called to live the Nazirite way and those vows, and particularly his great deeds, there is one little detail that would be easy to miss about how much of a God thing everything about Samson really was. Something happened right before every great act, every great feat of strength. For example, when we read about the killing of the lion, it says, "At that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and he ripped the lion's jaws apart with his bare hands." When he single-handedly took on 30 men, it says, "Then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and he went down to the town of Ashkelon, killed 30 men." When they tried to tie him up, and he ended up killing 1,000 with the jawbone of an ass, it says, "But the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson, and he snapped the ropes on his arms as if they were burnt strands of flax. They fell from his wrists, and he found the jawbone of a recently killed donkey. He picked it up and killed 1,000 Philistines with it." You see the pattern? Before every great act of strength and power, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. Why? Because that was the source of his strength and power. If a team of top scientists and physicians could go back in time and analyze Samson for the secret to his great physical strength, they wouldn't find it. They wouldn't see anything. He was not some genetic fluke. He would have been well under 6 feet tall, like the people of that day were. He wasn't ripped. There's nothing about his physical appearance like that. Get an image of Jack Reacher out of your head. His strength and his power was a God thing. This is why surrounding the story, people were always trying to figure out the source of his strength. You know, they're saying, what makes this guy so strong? What is the source of his power? I mean, look at him. He looks just like we do. And that bugged them, because if they could discover the source of his strength, they knew they could overcome him. So because this was a God thing, his choices, his vows as a Nazirite, his decisions in relation to living in such a way that God would continue to give this gift of strength, well, that was everything. Which brings up one last dynamic of Samson's life, critical to understand before we bring in the first bad girl of the Bible. Samson broke vow after vow. He went to drinking parties, so he broke that vow. He ate the wrong foods. He broke that vow. He touched dead carcasses of animals. He broke that vow. I won't even mention the prostitutes that he slept with. Broke that vow. Broke every vow associated with his relationship with God but one. Just one. And it was that last, final vow that kept him hanging on to God. Well, better put, kept God hanging on to him. And it was his hair. The last tie to the relationship, his calling and his vow, was that he never cut his hair. Which brings us now to our first bad girl of the Bible, Delilah. Here are a few things that we know about her. First, she was almost certainly a Philistine. The Bible doesn't tell us that directly, but everything we are told about her points to it. It's just almost incomprehensible that she wouldn't have been. Where she lived, how she lived, who she was in relationship with, who she conspired with. It all points to her being one of them, which means she would have worshipped false gods and idols. Her people embraced sexual acts and prostitution as part of their worship of those false gods and idols, even to the point of including child sacrifice. As a people, they had fully embraced the dark side of the world of the occult, which meant so had she. She was also sexually promiscuous, even by Philistine standards, if not a practicing prostitute. There's a lot of signs that she was a prostitute. In the culture of that day, for example, a moral woman would not be alone with a man, would not receive a man into her home unless her husband was there or her father or brother. She certainly wouldn't be living by herself that way. And women lived closed off, separated lives from men, and until they were married, lived with their immediate families. The only exceptions were barmaids and prostitutes. Delilah lived by herself. She exhibited unhindered contact with men. Men felt free to come directly to her whenever they wanted. Delilah was no barmaid. And of course, the entire story of Samson and Delilah takes place with her as his mistress or paid consort. She was not his wife. And with virtually every scene between them taking place in her inner rooms or bedroom. Third, we know that she had little or no moral conscience, and this goes beyond just her promiscuity. She was able to be bribed to purposefully betray someone who was in love with her, that she was in a sexual relationship with, and facilitate a horrific act against him. And that act was to determine how he could be bound so that he could be mutilated and tortured and in the end killed. And she knew that was the end game, and she was only too willing to see it done. So with that in mind, let's read what happened. Sometime later, Samson fell in love with a woman named Delilah. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, "Entice Samson to tell you what makes him so strong and how he can be overpowered and tied up securely. Then each of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver." Okay, stop there. Some things jump out that we don't want to miss. First, the Philistine rulers knew all about Delilah, not just about her relationship with Samson, but about her, the kind of woman she was, the kind that would be wide open to this kind of act. It was like, oh my goodness, Samson's in with Delilah. We know about Delilah, so now we've got an opportunity. Another thing is that the Philistine leaders knew that she would not be moved to act by loyalty. She was totally motivated by self-interest. So they had to go at her greed. No matter how much Samson might have loved her, she didn't love him, at least not as much as she loved money. It's often said, everybody has their price. That's really not true. I mean, there are things I'll bet you can think of right now that you would not do for money, no matter how much it was. Delilah was not like you. She was not one of those people. She would do whatever they wanted, no matter what it might mean, to even her current lover, if they paid her, and they were willing to pay. The Bible tells us that the collected rulers of the Philistines approached her. At that point in time in history, there were 5 such rulers at that point in time. So at 1,100 pieces of silver each, we're talking 5,500 pieces of silver. That was the equivalent of 550 times the annual salary of the day. We're talking millions and millions of equivalent dollars today. Why so high? Well, they were asking her to not only take a risk with trying to make the strongest man, to subdue the strongest man who's ever lived, but if successful, she would save the entire Philistine nation from destruction. So it wasn't too high of a price in their minds. That was a lot for their, bang for their buck. But they were also asking her to do something that even by Philistine standards was dark, cold, heartless, cruel, vicious, violent, and in the end murderous. So they decided we better pay her well, because we're asking her to do something truly diabolical. So they decided that here was a woman who, if they paid her enough, would do anything, even this. And they were right. She would carry it all out like a cold-blooded, pathological serial killer who felt nothing for her victim. Well, let's keep reading. So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me what makes you so strong and what it would take to tie you up securely." Samson replied, "Well, if I were tied up with 7 new bowstrings that have not yet been dried, I would become as weak as anyone else." So the Philistine rulers brought Delilah 7 new bowstrings, and she tied Samson up with them. She had hidden some men in one of the inner rooms of her house, and she cried out, "Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you." So Samson snapped the bowstrings as a piece of string snaps when it's burned by a fire. So the secret of his strength was not discovered. Okay, quick timeout. What is up with that whole kind of dialogue? Well, it's kind of like it all starts off like a game between the two of them. She probably said it more along the lines of, wink and a smile, "Honey, babe, what does make you so strong? And is there anything that can bind you? Yeah, I'm just curious. You can tell me." She teases, and he teases back. He gives her a just for fun answer. But then she does it and cries out for him to awake, because it just so happens that right after she tries it, tests it out, purely by coincidence, some Philistines had come to try and capture him. And she finds out he was playing with her. So she tries again. Let's keep reading. Afterward, Delilah said to him, "You've been making fun of me and telling me lies. Now please tell me how you can be tied up securely." Samson replied, "Well, if I were tied up with brand new ropes that had never been used, I would become as weak as anyone else." So Delilah took new ropes and tied him up with them. The men were hiding in the inner room as before, and again Delilah cried out, "Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you." But again Samson snapped the ropes from his arms as if they were thread. Again, more game. Then Delilah said, "You've been making fun of me and telling me lies. Now tell me how you can be tied up securely." Samson replied, "If you were to weave the 7 braids of my hair into the fabric on your loom and tighten it with the loom shuttle, I would become as weak as anyone else." Okay, now if that whole imagery lost you, you're not alone. If you're trying to visualize it, here's what an ancient loom would have looked like. So he actually said that if she used his hair like yarn or wool, like you see there, and wove it through a loom, and then would tighten the hairs like you would if you were bringing them together to form a blanket, he would lose his strength. But let's keep reading. So while he slept, Delilah wove the 7 braids of his hair into the fabric. Then she tightened it with the loom shuttle, and again she cried out, "Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you." But Samson woke up, pulled back the loom shuttle, yanked his hair away from the loom and the fabric. Okay, we got to stop there and raise something that I know you're probably already thinking about. Game or no game, doesn't matter. Doesn't he see that whatever he tells her, she's going to test out? And doesn't it just seem odd to him that with all 3 tests, there just happened to be some Philistines hiding in her outer room? So if on an IQ scale, 85 to 114 is average and 115 to 129 is above average or bright, where should we put Samson? I vote for about a 3 based on what we've read so far. But wait, he's getting ready to take the idea of doing stupid to a whole new level. Let's keep reading. Then Delilah pouted, "How can you tell me I love you when you don't share your secrets with me? You've made fun of me 3 times now, and you still haven't told me what makes you so strong." She tormented him with her nagging. By the way, in the original Hebrew, the word nagging literally means pressure, pressure, pressure. Day after day until he was sick to death of it. Okay, we know she didn't love him, but she knew he loved her, so she used that as her ace card to emotionally blackmail him, to challenge his love for her, to prove his love for her by revealing his secret. And she coupled it with incessant nagging, unrelenting emotional pressure until he couldn't stand it. And then, well, you know what happened. Let me read it, though. Finally, Samson shared his secret with her. "My hair has never been cut," he confessed, "for I was dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as anyone else." Now, again, a lot of people would read that and think Samson was a flaming idiot. How could you be more dense than this? 3 times she asked. 3 times he played games with her with his answer. 3 times whatever he told her, no matter how ridiculous, she did it. And 3 times Philistines just happened to be hidden in her house to attack him. Why would he tell her the truth? Was he really that gullible? That brainless? An IQ of 3? Actually, no. This isn't about his mental state. It is about his spiritual state. He didn't care if she knew the truth. He knew she'd test it out, just like she did the other explanations. He didn't care if she cut it because he didn't think it would matter. He'd lived his whole life in complete disregard of his vows, and his strength had never left him. So why care now? Why start even thinking about God now? No matter what he did, he was still the famed Samson. Do whatever he wants. Nothing had happened to him. So here at the end, he had reached the point where his vow meant nothing to him. He no longer felt God was behind his strength in any way. He felt his strength was his strength. So go ahead. She cuts it off. She cuts it off. It won't matter. Anything related to the vow or his relationship with God, irrelevant. He was a self-made man. That, he felt, had been proven time and again. In essence, Samson said, it doesn't matter what I do, how I live, how I act, long hair, short hair, I'm good. He was wrong. Let's keep reading. Delilah realized he had finally told her the truth. So she sent for the Philistine rulers. Come back one more time, she said, for he has finally told me his secret. So the Philistine rulers returned with the money in their hands. Delilah lulled Samson to sleep with his head in her lap, and then she called in a man to shave off the 7 locks of his hair. In this way she began to bring him down, and his strength left him. Then she cried out, Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you. When he woke up, he thought, and this is why he didn't think his hair would matter, I will do as before and shake myself free. But he didn't realize the Lord had left him. So the Philistines captured him and gouged out his eyes. They took him to Gaza, where he was bound with bronze chains and forced to grind grain in the prison. In that last little section, the focus is entirely on what Delilah purposefully, intentionally did. The verbs just leap off the page. She realizes he told her the truth. She sends for the Philistines. She lulls him to sleep. She calls in the man to shave his head. She began to bring him down. And there have been fewer, more damning depictions of that moment than the one painted by the famed Rembrandt back in the 1600s. Take a look. Here you see Delilah fleeing the room, scissors in one hand, Samson's hair in the other, while Samson's attackers gouge out his eyes, just like she knew they would. So what can we learn from all this? This interplay between Delilah and Samson. What's timeless here? Why did God want this story with all of its details preserved? Why is this bad girl of the Bible and what she did to others, why is it in the Bible? Well, let me give you at least 4 big lessons that I know jumped off the page from my life, and I think that is pretty low-hanging fruit from the story we just read. Here are the 4. First, be careful who you give your heart to. Samson gave his heart, allowed himself to fall in love with someone who, if he had properly vetted before he gave his heart, he would have found out she was immoral, evil, wicked, cold, and cruel, and did not love him. Now, she didn't wear any of those traits on the surface, but that's who she was if he had taken the time to find out. This is something I've counseled about for years. Make character judgments on the front end. Vet them completely. Don't date your way through that. Friendship your way through that. Because if you give your heart, if you allow emotions to run ahead, then you'll lose your head. You won't be thinking clearly. You won't be thinking critically, but emotionally and irrationally. And you can find yourself attracted to someone you never should have been attached with. People who say that if you're in love, that's all that matters, that's just so wrong. Love doesn't justify a relationship. It simply facilitates one. It enables one. It invites one. Romantic attraction carries no moral authority, no self-justification. It always has to be examined, put under a spiritual relational microscope. People say the heart doesn't lie. You don't know about hearts. Hearts are notorious liars and mislead people left and right. You have to see it, as Laura Smith once wrote, is this a love fitting for one of God's people? Because, as she adds, when we fall in love with someone and surrender to that experience, we will be shaped by the one we love. Samson should have never given his heart to Delilah. He knew she was a Philistine, knew she was a prostitute. That's how the relationship got started, with her being a prostitute. But he gave his heart and ignored it all. And it cost him everything. Here's the second life lesson. Be discerning when being pressured. If you're being pressured by anyone to do anything, evaluate the nature of that pressure. Pull yourself out, extricate yourself from that pressure, and look at it hard and cold, because there's good pressure And there's bad pressure. There's positive pressure and negative pressure. Being pressured to do something isn't always bad. Ask any athlete what a good coach can do for them. That's good pressure. But when you're being pressured, you've got to ask yourself some questions, because a lot of pressure has to do with moral issues, personality issues, lifestyle issues, choices. So here's some questions. If I wasn't being pressured in this way by this person on this thing, would this be the decision I would want myself to make? The one I would make on my own when I'm at my best? Another way of putting it, is what I'm being pressured to do going to bring me closer to Jesus, or is it going to take me further away from Jesus? Is it going to honor him, or is it going to dishonor him? Is this going to make him proud of me, or is this going to break his heart? I think you'll know the answer when you phrase the questions that way. Here's a third life lesson. View your strengths in light of the strength of God. Remember what we read earlier about Samson? Every time he did a great feat, it was because the Spirit of the Lord came on him. It was a God thing. It always was. Samson lost sight of that along the way. First taking small steps away, and then breaking minor vows, and then disobeying in little ways. And when nothing bad happened to him, when he didn't lose his strength, when good things kept happening, he just kept going further and further away from God, because in his mind, that just solidified the fact that his strength was his own and didn't come from God, didn't need God, so he could do whatever he wanted to do. See, there's nothing magical in the hair. Nothing. It was a sign. It was a symbol. The hair didn't make him strong. God did. That's what finally was cut off of his life. Not his hair. What was cut off was his relationship with God. Which is why, for me, the saddest, most tragic, most terrifying part of the story is found in an almost throwaway line of the narrative. After he gave in to Delilah and she cut his hair, when he woke up, do you remember what he said, or what the Bible said about that situation? Let me read it again. He didn't realize the Lord had left him. He didn't know. He'd always been able to do whatever he wanted with disdain for God and his vows, but there is a limit. There is a line. And for so many of us, we don't even know when we've crossed it, which is a terrifying thing to think about. We've been able to live how we want, do what we want, act like we want. We never got hit by lightning, never had calamity strike. And as a result, God kept getting smaller and smaller to us, and we saw everything in our life as being independent from God, not needing God, not coming from God, not protected by God, not strengthened by God. God didn't really matter. He was on the sidelines at best. And then comes the day that something happens and we need him desperately, and then and only then do we realize he left us. Or more accurately, we left him. One last life lesson. A life given over to self-interest destroys the life of the self. It's clear by the time that Samson met Delilah, she had pursued a single interest in life and given herself over to it. It was herself. Greed consumed her, her wants, her desires, her needs, her ends. She cared for no one but herself. And that kind of shriveled up life led to a shriveled up heart toward everyone else, which is why she could be so callous and evil towards Samson, a man in love with her. Rather than put her on top of her life, it emptied it to such a point that she could be bought for anything, by anyone. By always putting herself first, she'd actually become an object. She'd become a pawn, selling her body, eventually selling her soul. Her pursuit of self destroyed what self she had. So what happened to Delilah? We don't know. She's never mentioned again in the Bible. Not once. So many just assume she took her millions and lived out her life with not a care in the world. But I did read an interesting conjecture that I had never thought about before I began digging into this for this talk, and it rang true for me. And the more I dug into it, the more I thought, I wonder if that's what happened to her. Okay, here's the conjecture. Okay, she would have been famous among the Philistines for helping capture and subdue Samson. And her story would have been told wide and far. And she would have been infamous among the Jews and famous among the Philistines. I mean, how do you think the details of the story came from? It was just her and Samson in the room. And so it was her telling this. And so she was living off of this story. Her newfound wealth would have only added to her prominence. which means that when later Samson was paraded out before the Philistines for a planned celebration of his demise and for him to be mocked and ridiculed, who are you going to invite first? I mean, who's going to be at the top of that invite list? Maybe guest of honor. Delilah. Well, what happened at that event? Let me read. The Philistine rulers held a great festival, offering sacrifices and praising their god Dagon. They said, "Our God has given us victory over our enemy, Samson." When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy to us. The one who killed so many of us is now in our power." Half drunk by now, the people demanded, "Bring out Samson so he can amuse us." So he was brought from the prison to amuse them, and they had him stand between the pillars supporting the roof. Samson said to the young servant who was leading him by the hand, "Place my hands against the pillars that hold up the temple. I want to rest against them." Now the temple was completely filled with people. All the Philistine rulers were there, and there were about 3,000 men and women on the roof who were watching as Samson amused them. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me again. Oh God, please strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes." Then Samson put his hands on the 2 center pillars that held up the temple. Pushing against them with both hands, he prayed, "Let me die with the Philistines." And the temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people. So he killed more people when he died than he had during his entire lifetime. And one of the people killed may very well have been Delilah. Her life gone, her money forfeit, her life spent with nothing to show for it except facing the living God, bad to the bone. Well, next week, we'll look at the story of another bad girl from the Bible. She falls into the category of being bad for a moment, but it was so bad, it cost her her life. Well, until then, let me pray for you. Father, we're not going to find any of these stories uplifting and cheerful and make our hearts go lighter. They're going to be thought-provoking stories. We are looking at the dark side of human life. But we need these lessons because we want to walk in the light and we don't want to live lives like this. And so I just pray that even as we waded through the sordid life of Delilah that almost makes you want to take a shower after you've done it, we'll learn the life lessons that are so important to learn from her story. It's why you have it in the Bible. And so I pray that for every week. And I pray it in the name of Jesus. Amen.